All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Absolute Superman. Now, we're only 2 issues into this, so if you need to get caught up, you're one video behind. Make sure you click the playlist at the end of this. But the long and short of it is, we don't really know a whole lot about Absolute Superman. We know that Krypton was destroyed, as it always is, in the Superman mythos, and somehow he arrived on Earth. We'll get a couple bits and pieces over the course of this story. But one of the things this does is it kind of picks up in the immediate aftermath of the last video that we did, where Superman was not really as powerful as we're used to seeing him. If anything, he's really more almost kind of like Golden Age Superman, right? Where he can just leap tall buildings in a single bound, and he's really, really strong, but not like godly strong or anything along those lines. But he was basically in Brazil working alongside some miners who were basically under the control of a group called Lazarus. And seemingly, Lazarus is this organization or even company or governmental agency that kind of spans the globe, right? And so, because the absolute universe is a fairly dark place, that things are very harsh for people who work as these miners. When Superman showed up here, he actually started casting off the authority figures and almost kind of liberating the miners, if we want to call it that. This led to the Peacemakers arriving. And I love the way that Jason Aaron has done this, right? Most of you guys are familiar with Peacemaker, right? He's kind of like Batman in a lot of ways, right? Batman cherishes his no killing rule. He doesn't care how many men, women, and children have to die in order for him to keep it. Peacemaker's much the same way when it comes to peace. But the idea here is that in the absolute universe, instead of Peacemaker being one guy, there is a Peacemaker, and most likely this universe is one that we're familiar with, but the Peacemakers themselves are actually kind of a paramilitary force. And among them is Lois Lane. And that's the person that you get here, right? Now, the cool thing is Jason Aaron is going to kind of take this familiarity of Lois and just kind of wrap it in and kind of give us, to some degree, the Lois that we know and love, albeit with a few modifications. But Lois is a believer. Like so many other peacemakers here and people in positions of authority, she's kind of just blindly following orders, giving no real thought to what it is that she's actually doing. And so this kind of comes to a head with Superman, that initially she's just like, hand yourself over, right? Like, get on your knees, right? She's effectively trying to place him under arrest. But the whole time, he's basically talking to Saul. Now, Saul is the name of his suit, and it's one of these cool elements of the absolute Superman mythos that we're actually going to find out this suit has a really, really interesting caveat to it. But one of the big questions that Lois kind of finds herself wrestling with is, where do Superman's powers come from? Do they come from the suit or do they come from him? And I imagine some of you guys may be asking, like, where does the suit stop and Superman begin as far as all of his capabilities and so on? We'll get an answer to that. But one of the big issues that Superman has to contend with is that these handcuffs that have been put on him, specifically one cuff is attached to Lois and one cuff is attached to him, so he can't just fly away, that he can't quite break through them. And so ultimately it's up to like the suit to basically sever the cuffs. But the cool thing about this, and one of the things the suit says, is that the metal that comprises the cuffs themselves, that it basically rebuilds itself as Saul destroys the cuffs, right? So he can't just kind of like disintegrate the connection and the Superman can take off. It doesn't work that easily. It's a pretty ingenious maneuver here. The other part of this is that the Peacemakers themselves, they see Superman as target number one, right? That's the guy they're there to get. If they have to kill Lois to get to him, well, that's just the nature of the beast. So no honor among thieves, right? That at the end of the day, the job has to get done. And seemingly, the way that is kind of depicted here, it's where Lois really starts to begin to realize that they are all just expendable. Now, something else that I think is kind of funny here with the way that Jason Aaron does this, because Superman doesn't know what cuffs are, he calls them chuffs. I think it's just kind of a hilarious little tidbit. But ultimately, he's just kind of like, okay, so like, here's the deal. I got to get out of here. I'm not going to stick around here. And so what he does is he uses this substance called red dust and then effectively encases Lois Lane in it. In fact, he tells his suit, make sure that this doesn't like tear her in half. And Lois is terrified over this, right? But ultimately, Superman just takes off. Now, initially it looks like he's flying, and to the people that are chasing after him, it looks like he's flying as well. I mean, the reality here is that if somebody just like takes off into the distance and all you see is their body just sort of disappearing into the horizon, you're more or less going to believe that they're flying, right? Whereas Superman is effectively just jumping really, really far. In fact, he actually jumps about 8 miles. But one of the cool things that goes on in the middle of all of this is you get this kind of observation from Peacemaker himself, where one of the soldiers is just kind of like, okay, we request permission to engage. permission is given. And it says the Brainiac system suggests chemical rounds, level 11. And that's where essentially Peacemaker himself says, will do, though I can't guarantee the safety of the agent. And that's where the response is, nobody's asking you to, Peacemaker. And they say, copy that. Lazarus means life. Now, this can kind of be interpreted in a couple of different ways. Number one, it is actually Peacemaker. Number two, they all call themselves Peacemaker as a kind of an identity tied into a singular identity, right? You know, we are all Peacemaker, and so we refer to each one of each other as Peacemaker. The latter is most likely the scenario here, but I would like to believe that there is an actual Peacemaker who leads these guys, right? Like the guy who's in charge of everything. And so ultimately you just kind of follow Superman as he literally goes and jumps like 8 miles and lands in a small town. And that's when reality really starts to set in on Lois, because these missiles were fired off, chemical weapons essentially, which here in the real world have been banned since the Geneva Conventions. But the fact is, like, using them in such a cavalier way, right? Just having them follow Superman to wherever it is that he lands and they detonate or are supposed to detonate, it shows a complete and total lack of concern for any collateral damage or the sanctity of human life. And that's where Lois is really getting her first-hand glimpse at what peacemakers do. It's not that dissimilar from like Tony Stark, right? Like, yes, he built weapons, and yes, those weapons were shot off at some people somewhere, right? But like so many of us, when it comes to problems out there in the world that we just kind of ignore, well, it's because it's over there. And as long as it's over there, it's not over here. And if it's not over here, then it ain't my problem. And so that's kind of how Lois and really the peacemakers, whether intentionally from a place of being nefarious or just the result of circumstance, kind of viewed everything, right? It's just over there and they're just kind of doing their jobs and like that's it. But ultimately you get this really interesting back and forth between Superman and Lois. And it's one of the things that makes Absolute Superman so interesting, because a lot of you guys called this in the comments section of the first video that we did. It feels very reminiscent to like the Man of Steel. And this conversation between the two of them highlights that perfectly, right? Because there's this point where Superman says, like, I just saved your life several times and you still want to arrest me for it? And she says, no, you willfully endangered my life by trying to escape lawful custody, which you're not going to do. And she says, you endanger everyone by just existing, whatever it is that you are. And she's like, what are you? And he simply just says, just another child of the dirt trying to get by, kind of passing himself off as a person, just sort of trying to make it in the world. And she's like, so you're like a hippie who's bulletproof and could like jump really far. Is it the suit that makes you special? Who is Soul? People have a right to know. And that's when the kind of Man of Steel thing sort of chimes in. And it's like, who said people have a right to know? I never said they have a right to know. And they're asking for information about me. You say they have a right to know, but who are you? Of what relevance are you that you're so important that you have the ability to demand answers, right? It's very reminiscent of like that whole Man of Steel moment when Superman is like in a prison cell, he just stands up, he breaks his handcuffs, and he's like, you're afraid of me because you can't control me. And you're right. Humanity continues to exist because I allow it. At any point in time, I could wipe out your entire race, and there's nothing you could do to stop me. Nukes, nothing, it wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. And so it's really kind of interesting. Now, Superman doesn't really approach this from a place of, you know, kind of towering over Lois and showing her how powerful he is and that kind of stuff, right? People of any measure of power don't really need to put that power on display. That power is just recognized, right? Through how they talk, through how they carry themselves. People realize there's a kind of aura about them. And if for no other reason than just the evolutionary drive for protection, they will follow that person, right? They will do what that person tells them to. And so that's kind of the aura that Superman puts off, but it's one that Lois finds herself attracted to, because one of the things she kind of fires back with is, you don't know any people like me, Sunshine, believe me, right? This, of course, is in response to the statement that Superman makes where he's like, we're all just a bunch of livestock to people like you, right? You don't care about the kind of things that you do and how it impacts people. And so where she kind of fired back with her retort, he's like, arrogant, only cares about herself, angry at anyone that you think is not as smart as you, which is usually everyone who opens their mouth in your vicinity. You're everything that's wrong with your planet. Now, it's really phenomenal and really fascinating when he says that, because it gives Lois this huge indication, right? my planet. So you're not from this planet, is what you're saying, right? Now, that's one of the other cool things about Lois. Like Lois Lane, historically in DC Comics, right? Her and Superman are like the 1-2 punch of romantic couples, right? That's just the way that it is. It's them and then everybody else. Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson, Batman and Catwoman, kind of on again, off again, not really. The list goes on and on and on. But Lois as a character has always been written as a firecracker from the time that she was first introduced, right? In the old school action comics and Superman stories, right? All the way up to like the modern era. I think the best indication of that was towards the end of the New 52 when she revealed Superman's identity as Clark Kent to the world. That was cool. That was a really phenomenal piece of writing for her character. But she's one of these characters where she doesn't take lip off of anybody. It doesn't matter who they are or what they're capable of. And it's one of the things that's always made Lois Lane kind of this tried and true character that represents just like the strength of human resolve. Because I would like to believe that Lois's character, as she's depicted in comics, kind of transcends representing women or men or anything like that, and is kind of like a representative of the human race regarding her relationship with an inhuman man. So it is really, really cool, right? When you kind of get down into the nitty gritty of all that kind of stuff. But that's when the Peacemakers show back up and they just start firing off weapons at everybody. And Lois is watching just this indiscriminate attack and the complete lack of concern for anybody else who's out there. And it starts to turn her to his side. Not so much that she's just kind of like, all right, let's run away together and go find some romantic place so we can touch naughty bits for a little while, and then become like a husband and wife superhero duo and save the world. It's not really like that, but it is one of these things where Superman, of course, grabs a car, throws it at the helicopter, which takes the helicopter down. And then at that point, Superman realizing that these guys are on their way here, and the fact that there are people in this town, right, that are going to be sustaining injuries and so on and so forth, it's we need to get them out of here. Now, Superman says, right, this sunstone dust will shield you, right? This, of course, referring to the material that is encapsulating both the handcuffs as well as actually composed of his suit and his cape. But Lois kind of gives this play-by-play commentary of everything, and she says, Lazarus Field Agent After Action Report. My first thought was that it had to be the suit, but while the subject's advanced battle suit does display otherworldly properties, possibly including some level of sentience, after direct observation, this agent can say with profound certainty, it is not the suit. This Superman is plenty super on his own. Now, of course, she kind of begins to figure this out over the course of watching him rescue people, sustain damage to his suit, which is torn apart, but he's able to kind of withstand all of it with the greatest of ease, right? So clearly it's his physiology, it's not really the suit that he's wearing. She says the full extent of subject's powers remain uncharted. It is my impression that even he does not fully understand the limits of his abilities, as if this is all relatively new to him as well. In some ways, Superman is very much still a boy, one who has not yet fully deciphered who he is, but in other ways, he is every bit a man with an ethos that seems unshakable. Now, on the surface, this kind of seems like the thoughts and ramblings of a woman who is clearly romantically interested in Superman. And if the right circumstance presented himself, she would jump those bones in an instant. But the bigger point that's really coming out of this that Jason Aaron is making here is that he's becoming Superman. Not quite there yet, but in terms of us seeing him as kind of like this sort of de facto leader, right? The superhero who's out there that is kind of the shining bright star that exists out there that every superhero in some capacity models themselves after. He's getting to that place. More so than that, he has powers that he just hasn't tapped into yet, right? That his abilities will grow as he learns to harness those powers more and more. And so it's really just kind of Jason Aaron saying, there's a few more tricks up his sleeve. We're just getting started here, which makes me very, very excited. But what he also does is he uses this kind of dust in order to like heal the injuries of people who have sustained these various injuries in the attack and so on and so forth. But Lois continues this commentary, right? She says, subject switches from a shy, soft-spoken demeanor to a more confident, commanding presence depending on the circumstance, without either facet coming across as an affectation. This feels like a man who cannot help but be earnest, who could never lie, even if he needed to. We know from the other sightings that he's traveled the globe. He speaks multiple languages, but somehow he still has the air of a lost child, of a life in some way interrupted, of a son without a home. A deep mistrust of authority seems ingrained. Suspect will prove quite difficult to coerce or apprehend. And she says, despite repeated attempts, this agent never really had a chance. Now, of course, in that way, she's lying, right? She's literally cooking the books here. There was an opportunity for her to subdue him, given the fact that he was in somewhat of a weakened state. And Superman recognizes this, right? He simply looks to her and he says, thank you. Now, this is kind of a dual meaning in terms of him saying that, right? It's thank you for helping me and all this kind of stuff, which is how Lois takes it. But it's also thank you for not arresting me, for not subduing me and not turning me in. Now, of course, this also leads to Lois sort of chiming in for a couple things, right? She's like, suggested course of action is further study, intense study. I hereby formally request a full-time Superman assignment. Agent Lane's private notes, he smelled like oak barrels full of burgundy, stored for 1,000 years in a musty basement. He smelled amazing. So clearly she's smitten with him. And how could you not be, right? Just this incredibly powerful character that's masculine in almost every conceivable way, but also tender in all the ways that she's hunting for, appears out of nowhere. To say nothing of the fact that the guy's gorgeous, right? Like, he's got it all. Of course she's going to be smitten with him. And there's even this point where Superman kind of becomes a little philosophical, right? He's like, there's this place in the Arctic Ocean. I think it's Svalbard. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce that, but it's these islands with more polar bears than people, where the sun sometimes shines for days on end. But when it's night, you can see more stars than you could possibly imagine. So many of those stars are orbited by nothing but chunks of rock and methane, undeveloped planets with no life on them. Do people have any idea how precious a place this is? Now, this, of course, is kind of drawing on Carl Sagan, right? The pale blue dot, right? There's one of those landmark speeches about the value and significance of the human race and how precious the Earth is, because if we were to somehow destroy the world, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere for you to go to, right? I mean, you could hide underground and maybe survive it, but even then, that's probably not going to happen. And so the lives that people have here are connected, they're intertwined, they're all shared. And that's one of the big differences between Krypton as a world and Earth itself. Krypton had its fair share of problems, and I have no doubt that over the course of the Absolute Superman comics, we're going to see what a lot of those problems are, because as we get towards the end of this, which we are coming up on the ending here, that we do kind of get a kind of glimpse into really arrogance, hubris, that sort of thing that seemed to plague Krypton. But what it didn't have was separation. It didn't have borders or anything like that. There were no invisible lines that differentiated this group from that group using arbitrary things. People, following religion and all of them battling over whose imaginary friend is more real than the other person's imaginary friend, right? That kind of thing. But at the end of the day, this really kind of follows this philosophy of Superman and simply adopting this mentality of people, like human beings are human beings. Like, all of you occupy this world. Why do you have things that separate you? Now, that's kind of a long-standing philosophy of Superman in DC Comics, but I love to see that Absolute Superman is kind of developing this attitude or this philosophy the way that Jason Aaron's writing him. It's really, really cool, and I absolutely adore it. But he even says, like, I'm one of those sons of nothing. My planet, and where he goes to tell Lois what his planet was called, the handcuffs loosen, and then he's whisked away by the dust. So, like, that's it, right? And so Lois is just kind of observing and watching things. And so at that point, you switch over to the after action report, which is really kind of monitored by the Brainiac AI. Now, Brainiac AI really looks like an actual person, right? Plugged into some computer system. So it's not like Skynet, right? Just some thing that exists out there in the ether that's all just kind of software in cyberspace. But this may turn into like the actual Brainiac villain as we know him, albeit a far more grounded version of the character. But still, the entirety of Lois Lane's interview is basically being modified to achieve a particular goal, right? How would you rank the danger of Superman? Well, I don't know that I would really rank him as much of a danger. Level 8, cool, confirmed. Wait, no, that's not what I said. The questions kind of continue on. Do you think Superman is a threat to humanity? Can he be controlled? Well, I don't necessarily know if he could be controlled or not. I mean, I know he cannot be controlled, but I don't know if he'd be considered a threat. Cool, we should terminate him. And like, that's it, right? It's looking for a particular outcome to the questions that are being asked. And when that outcome's not given, it just cooks the books and makes it up. And so it's just one of these really interesting things because that's seemingly how the Peacemakers function. As this sort of paramilitary peacekeeping force, they don't ask questions. There's a name comes across their desk and they go after the name and that's it, right? That's really all there is. But this kind of throwback to like the nature of Lois, right? This basically do whatever it takes, tough as nails reporter comes in the form of the fact that she decides to write her own after action report. And despite the fact that she seemingly hates writing, she actually loves doing it. Now, I don't know if this means she's going to start writing everybody's reports all the time or that she's going to go and become a reporter. But it's just kind of Jason Aaron saying, like, hey, those threads that you're familiar with of Lois, right? Being a reporter, writing these Pulitzer Prize winning, articles or opinion pieces or whatever, she's still very much there. She just looks a little bit different and acts a little bit different and is different in a lot of ways. But at that point, we jump back to Krypton before its destruction. And that's one of the things to keep in mind, right? In the first video, we talked about that. There's a kind of back and forth that goes on in these comics between the events that led up to the destruction of Krypton and Superman arriving on Earth, and slowly it's kind of bridging the gap between the two. But what we end up learning is that this sunstone dust was actually created by like Lara herself. But again, unlike the traditional Superman mythos, where the parents of Superman were part of the Science Council on Krypton, and despite being, kind of honored members of its society, that their warnings of Krypton's destruction just kind of went unheeded. In this reality, or at least in the Absolute universe, they're farmers. Right? I mean, that's really all they are. They're Luke Skywalker's aunt and uncle from the Star Wars mythos. And so the big concern they have here is that if they take this information to the clerics, right, this knowledge that Krypton is effectively falling apart at the core, it's only a matter of time before the planet's destroyed. Would they listen to them? Would the clerics listen to Jor-El, right? Would they even acknowledge the warning? And even if they did, it could take years to build enough ships in order to actually liberate the people of Krypton and create some measure of an evacuation. But they don't have years. And so what they end up doing is that while they do believe that it is important to tell the Science Council what's happening to reveal the danger of Krypton's imminent destruction, they also create a kind of backup plan, right? That Jor-El will do whatever it takes to keep his family protected. And if that means stealing the materials necessary while he's out there as a miner, and in turn, bringing that stuff back illegally, it doesn't matter, right? They'll build a kind of sunstone ship for themselves and call it a day. Because the sunstone material is highly malleable, right? So it serves as both a kind of suit of armor as well as functioning as a kind of spacesuit. So in reality, it's not that dissimilar from the Venom symbiotes in Marvel Comics, if you want to look at it that way. And so again, all these little roads are kind of leading to each other. Now, the real question to ask here, because Krypto has appeared in 2 stories so far, 2 issues so far, what happens to Krypto? Because I'm going to tell you right now, if Jason Aaron kills Krypto, if Krypto gets left behind and he dies or something along those lines on Krypton's destruction because they can't bring him, I will swear off Jason Aaron as a writer forever. And I will never cover this comic again because that would piss me off to no end. I'm not even gonna lie. But the last little tidbit of this is basically switching over and kind of revealing a couple of different things. The first is that Superman's on the move again, right? Just kind of walking from one location to the next, basically traveling to Venezuela. But there's also a kind of antithesis, right, to Lazarus, the organization that Lois Lane works for as part of the Peacemakers, that the antithesis here are the Omega Men that are seemingly a kind of resistance force. Now, we don't know if they're a resistance force made of good guys who are trying to do the right thing, or if they're a resistance force looking to get rid of Lazarus and then supplant it with their own form of authority, right? Absolute power corrupting absolutely. We don't really know which direction they're going in. But the last little tidbit that we get here is when you switch over to the Peacemakers in this small town in Brazil. And it's one of these things where it's all these people here, right? They refuse to tell us where Superman went to, but we've done so much for them. So it's important to send a message using these people, right? Peace has a price. And so those individuals who will not tell us what we want to know, those individuals who harbor Superman, who refuse to give us information on where he went to, we'll make examples out of them. And so what this guy does is he turns his gun on all these guys and summarily executes them on the spot. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Yes, this is a really dark Superman comic, but I love it, man. What does it say? That the Absolute line of comics is kind of better than the main DC Universe stuff right now. I'm digging it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and I will catch you all later. Peace.